Hey there, my name is David Rogers, and I want to welcome you to the Nashville Jazz Workshop's Artist Spotlight, where every month I get the chance to sit down with a handful of artists with upcoming performances at the legendary Jazz Cave in Nashville, Tennessee. We get to dive into a bit of jazz history while also learning about each artist's process of preparing for their upcoming show. This week I sat down with keyboardist and producer Alex Murphy ahead of his Robert Glasper Tribute show. We spoke about his earliest encounters with Glasper's music, from the early trio records to the more recent Black Radio collaborations. The impact Robert Glasper's genre-bending sound has had on the music industry as a whole. And Alex told us about some of the special guests who will be joining him on stage this Saturday evening. I hope you enjoy. Man, Alex, thanks so much for dropping by the studio, man.
Man, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited. So we have a tribute to Robert Glasper this Saturday, June 8th.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about kind of how this idea came about, why Robert Glasper, what's interesting to you about his music?
Right. It starts really with, I think, my own musical journey and my interest in Glasper.
Yeah.
I grew up in a really musical family. And I was encouraged to play a bunch of different instruments, and my father was in the CSO for a little bit in Chicago where I grew up.
Yeah.
As a classical French hornist. And so I was always listening to new stuff, and my dad would bring records home, or we'd go to the library and just burn CDs,
Nice.
together to check new things out. And he found this record, Black Radio 1, the original Black Radio that Robert Glasper put out under the Experiment, his first Experiment record.
Yeah.
And I remember in high school hearing it, and I was just mesmerized. I'd never heard something like this. I grew up on a eclectic mix of music, from Boston to Cheap Trick, Supertramp, even into a lot of classical music and lots of jazz, to be sure. And I just remember hearing this and thinking to myself that I'd never heard anything quite like this. And I just dove really deep into the liftoff, the mic check liftoff thing. The thing that Glasper is doing on the piano just completely blew my mind.
Yeah.
And it's just like a really simple thing, but it was so meditative and set this mood. And I didn't know that the piano could be used in a modern context like that. And so that kind of started this journey for me where I kind of worked backwards from Glasper. I really dove deep into Herbie Hancock my senior year of high school.
Gotcha.
And then I went to DePaul, and, that's where this journey for me gets a little interesting, because Glasper's music is not in school respected.
Yeah.
And I kind of got pushed away from it.
Okay.
And school is one thing, and I'm sure we could have a whole nother conversation about, the ups and downs, the positives and negatives of school. But I really kind of moved away from it for a couple years. And then a close friend of mine in Chicago, who's a couple years younger than me, an amazing drummer named Jeremiah Collier, who's been on the road with Stanley Clark recently in Stanley's young band. He heard me play once, and he told me, you kind of sound a little bit like Robert Glasper.
Cool.
And I kind of let it go, and then he had a hit at the Hyde Park Jazz Festival featuring him, and he wanted to do a bunch of Glasper stuff. And so this was in between my sophomore and junior year of college, and I dove way deep back into it again.
Yeah.
It was almost like coming back home. It felt very comfortable, and for whatever reason, the harmony and the rhythm and the melodic sense that he had just made sense to me for whatever reason. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons, and I'll talk about this at the show, but one of the reasons that is like Glasper's musical personality is representative really of like every part of American culture, and specifically the Black American music experience. Yeah. And, his mother was a classical pianist who really dove into classic gospel on piano. Right. And so he grew up in Houston, a great city with an amazing set of musical tradition.
Yeah.
And so my journey with that just continued to progress. And then in Chicago, there's a lot of hip hop. And so I kind of fell into playing some hip hop stuff.
Yeah.
And then when I moved to Nashville post-pandemic, I realized that there wasn't much of this kind of music happening. And the right people came into my life at the right time, where I had an opportunity to continue to develop my love for this and continue playing Glasper's music. I was hesitant at first when we had initially talked about this, because Glasper obviously is still alive and creating.
Yeah,
right.
It sure is.
Right. And he is kind of reformed music in a way, whether people realize it or not, from his experience with Lauryn Hill and Erykah Badu, Bilal, Common, Q-Tip, all of these, icons of the way music changed with hip hop in the 90s and still into the early 2000s and still today. He, on several occasions, has shifted music without people really realizing it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a daunting thing, and I've never said that I wanted to sound like Robert Glasper. It just happens to be that a lot of my influence comes from a place that he drew influence from.
Yeah. How do you go about thinking about a tribute to Robert Glasper when he is so, like, his discography is so vast? I mean, I think a lot of people come to know him through the Black radio stuff.
Right.
Obviously, won Grammy or multiple Grammys in those records. But, I mean, the trio stuff predates all of that.
Oh,
and
man.
it's so deep, and it's a different sound.
Right.
Are you touching on that at all?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is difficult is like his music really is very genre bending, and you can't place it in any genre.
Right.
And actually, it's funny you bring up the Grammys because it's funny what, the Grammys even have decided what his music is, right?
Yeah.
And so I think he's up to like 7 or 8 Grammy wins now, which is incredible. But when you look at the difference between his experiment and his trio, I think the concept is actually pretty similar and really well thought out. And if you listen to his first 3.5 trio records, because Double Booked is a split that he does, the compositions are almost just as genius as all of his improvisation and his facility and his rhythmic prowess. Like the compositions were really what drew me in.
Okay.
But then when you get into his most recent trio record, Covered, he's just playing his favorite songs, right? And he does Music Soul Child and Joni Mitchell, and he does Stella by Starlight, and so he picks his favorite songs, covers them on that record.
Yeah.
So I'm going to approach his music from every angle, actually.
Okay.
We'll be doing some of my favorite things that he has done in his trio. I'm going to do some of his, the things people really know him for, and I've got some great artists that I'll mention here in a second joining me to really pay homage to those. But I'm also picking some things that were really formative for me from a learning standpoint. There's this one song in particular called I'm Country and That's Okay. Yeah. It might be one of my favorite compositions ever. I mean, it's just like really strong melody, intriguing harmony, but the composition, there's like 2 sections and they're very different compositionally. And somehow he makes them work seamlessly. And so we're going to approach it from that. And it was hard finding players that bridge that gap. And interestingly enough, like the different phases of his group had overlap to some degree, right? It was Vincente and Damian Reed at first. And then it's shifted to Chris Dave and Derek Hodge in his acoustic trio, but then that switched over to the Glasper experiment, right? And kept Derek and Chris Dave. And then Mark Collenberg is brought into the mix because Mark was like a little younger than Chris Dave and was the next drummer in this line of New York drummers, that jazz drummers in particular, that were being used for the hip hop, the really heavy hip hop stuff. And so Glasper brings Mark Collenberg in. And so all of this, kind of transpires. And, but Glasper has continued to bring young musicians in. Now it's Bernice, Travis, and I believe Justin Faulkner. And so, it's really cool seeing the evolution.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love most about Glasper's more recent albums is it really feels like a family affair. Like he's playing his favorite music, but with his favorite people. Like he's bringing in his friends, and the collaborations are ridiculous.
Yeah, the collaborations are unbelievable, and especially when you're talking about Mos Def and Bilal and Common in particular. Erykah Badu, of course, is that Afro Blue recording, which we'll do.
Okay,
that is like one of the most iconic things people take away from what Glasper's sound is. Right?
Yeah. I feel like that track has become almost like a modern jazz standard. Like we'll play it on gigs.
Oh my gosh,
just like background music gigs or wedding cocktail hour gigs. It's become part of as much so as Stella by Starlight or All the Things You Are.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I try to think about when we think about jazz history. We think about Bird and Dizzy making their own versions of great American songbook songs, but at that time they were just pop music, right?
Right.
And Glasper has decided that he is interested in bringing people, listeners, what he, from experience, knows that they want, right? They want to hear things that are recognizable. And the biggest innovation for that is in the drums. Because people don't listen to music in the same lens. Like we listen to all music now with a hip hop drum lens. Country music now is being made with hip hop based drum machines and 808s and all of these different things, right?
Samples are replacing the actual thing, triggers.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting hearing how he's paired these things. And the drummer that's playing on this show is a drummer named Christian Bergs. And Christian is from Houston, and which is where Robert Glasper's from.
Yeah.
And there's a long line of musicians that went to the same high school that Christian and Robert Glasper both went to. I'm going to botch it, HPVCA, or anyway, it's a Houston Performing Arts School.
Yeah.
And there's a sound that comes out of that city.
Yeah.
Whatever culturally, has transpired over X amount of years has led to this sound.
Yeah.
And so something that I didn't really realize when I was putting this together is that the bass player and the drummer that I'm using, Weldon Scott is the bass player who lives in LA. They both went to this high school that Robert Glasper went to.
Wow, that's cool.
And that's kind of an interesting full circle moment.
Totally.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about the personnel. I mean, you bring in some amazing special guests. I checked out all their Instagrams. Maybe you can shout them out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about the person that I have the longest relationship with. Brian Brown, who's born and raised in Nashville, is a really, really, really thoughtful, incredible hip-hop artist, lyricist, and he sings a little too, which you'll hear, and he's got a really nice voice. And Brian, came into a gig I was playing last summer, and I was playing this Ahmad Jamal song called I Love Music. One small part of that is the basis for the sample for The World Is Yours by Nas. So Brian comes up to me, he's like, man, I love Ahmad Jamal. I think he's amazing, and I love listening to what people sample of his. And so Brian and I, from that moment on, have had a really strong relationship, and we've been on this journey of pairing jazz and jazz-related things with hip-hop.
Nice.
So Brian will be featured on a number of things. I've got 2 female vocalists, the first of which is a powerhouse that I met about a year and a half ago named Trula.
Okay.
And Trula has a voice that you just can't really describe. I mean, it's so easy and natural, and again, it's really compelling. And she and I do a lot of work together, and so that's going to be a lot of fun. The other vocalist I have is, her name's Summer Joy.
Okay.
And I met Summer through the drummer, Christian. And Summer has a humongous voice, and she embodies all the things that the vocalists that are featured on Glasper's stuff embody. And that was kind of my goal with this. I'm not trying to replicate any of what has been done. I wanted to put my own, approach it in the way that it would be approached by Glasper, not do what's on the record necessarily.
Yeah.
Because I just find that to be a little more compelling and honest,
Totally.
The last artist is someone that I haven't really done a ton of work with, but he's really interesting. His name's Jaron Blair. He's got a great voice. He's a keyboard player as well, and he is really deep into vocal effects and live vocal pedals and all that sort of stuff. And obviously we just recently lost Casey Benjamin. And so he will be kind of in that mold, in that role in terms of what the group is doing, adding that depth, the width and the depth. Yeah. The only thing that I wish I could have done was have a DJ come and do stuff.
Next time.
Yeah, next time.
Just you describing each of these artists in their own right has me so excited for Saturday, because knowing Glasper's music, knowing a little bit about each of these individuals, knowing where you're coming from as kind of the producer of this show and the primary artist and keyboardist, it just has me so excited to kind of imagine all the possibilities. There are so many sonic possibilities, and I don't want you to spoil all of them, but maybe just give us a glimpse into what's one thing or one song or one moment or something that you're particularly looking forward to, something that we as the audience can really look forward to.
Yeah, there's a moment it's honestly kind of a underappreciated Glasper record called Art Science.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, with Vicente.
Yes. Yeah. And so Art Science is really interesting because he dives more into full electronic possibilities.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go that far in terms of the electronic possibilities, but there's a track that they do right at the top. The first thing you hear is this burnout, absolute burnout in E minor. And, it's just, it's fast, it's energetic and emotional, and it devolves into this other groove. That sets up the whole premise of what Glasper's really about, which is every music that Black American culture has given, he
Yeah.
wants to be at his disposal to be part of his voice.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things you'll hear is that there's not a genre that's going to be off limits, a traditional genre
Yeah.
that's off limits in this show. And I'll be excited to see how people receive the blurring of the line.
Yeah.
Right. Because like this word jazz is interesting, and I'll save all of my thoughts on that for another time. But the word jazz, really it's fought over a lot. And so I try not to use that word too much, especially when you're talking about an artist like this.
Yeah.
And so I'll be really interested to see how people receive the flowing from one place to another, and also the way the set is put together.
Yeah.
It's not going to be necessarily like we are going to take a couple detours.
Yeah.
So that'll be nice. I enjoy that part of it. In the middle of the set is where I'll be most excited to see how people react, because we're going to come out with his like original trio stuff.
Awesome.
So as the evening goes on, it'll get a little bit more like what am I listening to?
Almost like chronologically moving
Yeah.
through his discography.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. And that's something, even when I play live in town, I try to, let audiences know that I'm not really trying to call this anything.
Yeah.
You're going to hear a lot of different influences.
Yeah.
And so I would love to see how people take what they hear.
Absolutely, man. Well, I'm excited. Tickets are already selling well.
Sure.
And yeah, I'm excited to pack the house and to give you a
Yeah.
good audience for
I
what sounds like
appreciate
a
that.
great show.
We're definitely excited. It's going to be a good evening.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, I'll see you there.
Thanks, David.